Everybody, can everybody see the screen?
I can see it fine. Thank you, Claudia.
Excellent. So welcome to the Member Network event. This is a social event, but with a little bit of information about bats and cetaceans and how they use echolocation. We have already been introduced. So I'm the Scottish Bat Officer with the Bat Conservation Trust, and Ashleigh will be presenting the cetacean part of the presentation.
Great introduction by Annie as well, thanks.
This is a relatively short talk, so we're hoping there will be lots of questions in chat afterwards, but we'll do a little introduction. Well, Annie has done the introductions, then we'll talk about bioacoustics, bats and cetaceans, and then you can ask us all your questions afterwards. Bioacoustics is a cross-disciplinary science that combines biology and acoustics, and usually it refers to the investigation of sound production, dispersion, and reception in animals, including humans. And echolocation is a biological sonar used by several animal species, including cetaceans and bats. And echolocating animals emit calls out to the environment and listen to the echoes of these calls to return from various objects near them. They use the echoes to locate and identify objects, and echolocation is used for different things like navigation, foraging, and hunting in various environments. I will quickly introduce bats, the group of bats. So as you will probably all know, bats are mammals, and worldwide we have over 1,400 different species of bats, with new species being discovered frequently because they are quite a difficult group to study. So there's still a lot to discover. In the UK, we've got currently 18 species, and in Scotland, it's approximately 9 we know of that are resident. As I said, there's still a lot to find out, so these numbers go up quite frequently. Because there's so many species, there's also a huge variety in the diet of bats. We've got insectivorous bats, all of the UK bats are insectivorous, then bats that eat fruit, fish, and many more different food sources. For their size, they have an incredibly long lifespan. So a bat lives about 10 times as long as a rodent, for example, of an equivalent size. And the evolutionary model of bat basically has been around for a long, long time. They are a very successful group and have existed for over 60 million years. That picture on the bottom right there is from the Eocene, so 52.2 million years ago, which is a very long time. So the whole evolutionary model of bat is very successful. Bats are the only true flying mammals. We know of gliding squirrels, for example, but bats are the only mammals with true powered flight. And that contributes very much to their worldwide distribution. They occur on every continent around the world. Some remote islands, you don't get bats, and also in the Antarctic, you don't get bats. But you do get them above the northern circle. All bats belong to the order Chiroptera, which translated means hand wing. So chiro, the hand, ptera is the wing. And the wings are formed from elongated finger bones with a flight membrane that spans across these fingers. So they have a very intricate flight, actually. Interestingly, molecular analysis shows that bats are more closely related to whales or cetaceans, horses, and pangolins than they are to humans. The ultrasound that bats use is defined, so ultrasound in general is defined as any sound that is beyond the human hearing. Our hearing reaches to approximately 20 kilohertz. If you're younger, your hearing is better and you can hear the higher frequencies. Unfortunately, with age, that deteriorates slightly, and your hearing drops slightly below the 20 kilohertz. So some children and young people are actually able to hear almost into, hear some bats into the kind of 20 kilohertz frequencies. So the definition of ultrasound is really sound beyond this line of human hearing above 20 kilohertz. And as I said before, bats use ultrasound as a sonar. The sound bounces off an object and they can listen to the echo and basically form a picture of the world based on the time it takes for the sound to come back, the echo to come back. So they form a picture of the world just based on echolocation. They do also use eyesight, but as our bats hunt in the dark, echolocation is one of the main senses that they use. All of our UK species do use echolocation. They also use ultrasound for communication, but obviously that doesn't involve an echo coming back. That is just to call out to other bats. Most fruit bats don't echolocate, although we know that the Egyptian fruit bat uses tongue clicks, and there are 3 other fruit bat species we know use clicks with their wings. So they also use echolocation. They just use a different mechanism for producing the sound. The typical echolocation call for our UK bats just lasts along around 1 to 5 milliseconds. So it's a very, very short sound. Horseshoe bats, which we get in England and Wales, and also mainland Europe and Ireland, so further south, their calls can last up to 50 milliseconds. In the UK, the bats emit the sound through the mouth or the nose, and quite a lot of the bats that emit the sound through the nose have these really intricate nose leaves and nose shapes that are specifically adapted to facilitate that sound emission through the nostrils. We can use bat detectors. Some of you may have seen them, little machines basically that make the sound audible. They transform with different technologies. They transform the ultrasound sounds into sounds within our hearing range, so we can listen to the echolocation of the bats. And we can use that for identification of different bat species, either listening to the bat detector directly with our ears and using our brains and knowledge, or we can record sounds and use computer software to analyze bat sound and then find out which species we have. It is quite interesting that bats adapt their echolocation sounds depending on the environment. So they emit slightly different calls, whether they're in a very cluttered environment or whether they're in open space. The use of ultrasound for echolocation is mainly because higher pitched sounds have a higher resolution. So they bounce off tinier objects. And if you think of a small bat hunting even smaller prey, like midges, for example, bats need this high resolution of information coming back from the echo to be able to catch their prey species. Our bats produce the echolocation calls with a larynx, just like us, like humans produce sounds, so with our voice box. And one of the main differences is that the sound bats emit is extremely loud. Ultrasound doesn't travel very well in air, and they have to call really loud, up to 140 decibels actually, which is a lot louder than a rock concert. So if they did call in the human hearing range, there would be a real risk of harming our hearing. And for that reason, bats have evolved a mechanism that actually pulls away the ear bones that transmit sound to the eardrum whilst they're calling. So they're preventing deafening themselves with this extremely loud call. And this mechanism is really fast. It's milliseconds because the echolocation call is only milliseconds long. But this way, with their extremely loud calls, they don't harm their own hearing. I've now got a very brief video showing a pipistrelle bat hunting in airspace. So this is one of our most common bat species in Scotland, and what you will hear is the echolocation calls of this bat. The sound is transformed by a bat detector into noises within our hearing range. So I hope you could all see that the bat was hunting prey in the airspace and using these loud echolocation clicks to navigate through the airspace and as well catch the prey. I will now hand over to Ashleigh, and Ashleigh, you can just let me know whenever you want the next slide. Unfortunately, I can't see anybody's faces, so my setup isn't good enough for that. If you can just tell me when to change slide, that would be great. Thank you.
No problem. That's great. Thank you very much for that, Claudia. That was fascinating. I've been on quite a few bat surveys and listened to the bat detectors, and it's just really interesting being able to hear them while you're watching them. But yeah, fascinating. So thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about cetaceans now. So these are our whales, dolphins, and porpoises. It just saves me having to say that all the time. And we have cetaceans. They're all obviously in the water medium. They are considered as apex predators and carnivores. We don't have as many species to remember. We have around about 90 or so species, but that changes as we discover new species. We discovered a new beaked whale around, I think it was 2 years ago, if I'm remembering correctly. And within this group, our cetaceans are split into two groups. So we have our odontocetes and our mysticetes. And both groups create sound, but both groups don't create sound equally. So for example, our mysticetes, which are our baleen whales, they generally use sound for communicating, whereas our odontocetes, so our toothed cetaceans, which use echolocation, often use sound for foraging and navigating. So they don't use sound equally across the board cetaceans. They use it split in this odontocete and mysticete groups. And if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Claudia. Okay, so why do they use sound then? So I just wanted to, before we start talking about bioacoustics and echolocation in cetaceans, I just want to discuss why they use this sound in water, and particularly why this has evolved. So we are humans, we use light and visual cues as our main sense, whereas in the water, light only penetrates the first 200 meters. And it can get quite dark underwater. So we do know that sound travels a little bit faster in water as of light. It can travel up to 5 times faster. If you want to move on to the next slide, Claudia. I have got a video here, but you may want to mute the video before playing because there's a lot of screaming and shouting. So this is just to show. So this is a pod of killer whales that we have here. You can see them just on the left there. There we go. So they're just coming up on the left there. And you can see, you can't see all the way through that water. You know, not a lot of light is penetrating that water. And these killer whales will be feeding. These animals were foraging at the time that we saw them. They were up for a few minutes, catching their breath, going back down for a few minutes. And it's going to be pretty dark down there. Next slide. So sound does travel a lot faster underwater than it does in air, and it's not comparable. So sometimes you will see in text where they say, you know, this sound is this many decibels, this is equivalent to da 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 da. Underwater and air are not comparable. You can't really make the same conclusions about sound underwater. The reasons are the speed of sound is really dependent on the temperature, the salinity, and the pressure underwater. And we can see that clearly in the left image here, which shows the SOFAR channel. So this is the deep sound channel, which is what we think our Mr. Seat whales use for their low frequency calling and communication. This is a channel where low frequency noise is simply refracted and reflected within, rather than escaping this channel and getting lost. Somewhere in this channel, the depth, the temperature, and the salinity and pressure all change that create this sort of channel that keeps the noise, or keeps the sound rather, within this channel, which is really, really interesting. But you can see on this graph on the left in that image that the speed of sound is changing as we go deeper. It's also very similar with pressure changes, temperature changes, and salinity as well. And we do have transmission loss underwater as well. So when we're talking about how sound travels and the propagation of sound, on the graph on the right hand side, so where the red is started, that's where the sound has, the source has started. So we've got that at about 500 meters, bounces to the surface. And if you think we've got that water layer turning into air, so some of that sound is then transferred back, reflected back, but we also have that seabed as well. And the seabed does absorb some sound, however, it can reflect back off the seabed as well. Next slide, please. So we know then that sound is pretty much the way to go underwater. It travels 5 times faster. Light isn't too good. It doesn't get past 200 meters. So our cetaceans will, you know, they have evolved to use sound to communicate, navigate, and forage. And some of these odontocetes that can dive, you know, up to 3 hours and down to 3,000 meters, where they probably don't see light for the last 2 hours of that, or maybe more. So they really, really do rely on sound underwater. Next slide, please. So here we have just a simple schematic of echolocation. So as Claudia has introduced, echolocation is where we use sound to forage for food, or to locate an item. The way that it works in a dolphin, so we've got the odontocete or dolphin's head here, and we have, it's labeled as nasal sacs here, but there's also an organ called phonic lips, or they're called monkey lips because they look like monkey lips. This organ vibrates really, really quickly, and it sits just behind this organ, the melon. And the melon just contains lots of lipids. It's really, really fatty. And the way that works is it really amplifies the sound. So the sound goes out into the environment. It bounces off an item such as a swim bladder in a fish. This then reverberates back into the lower jaw, and the returning echo is received by the lower jaw, which is also connected to the inner ear. So they're able to detect that sound straight back through their jaw and in their ear, and detect an animal really, really well. And I think we've got a video just demonstrating this next. Thank you. So we've got a dolphin here. It's obviously looking for something. It's echolocating into the surface, into the seabed, thinking it's pinpointed something straight into the sun, and it's detected a fish. So it was obviously, you know, going over the surface, over the seabed there, echolocating. You can see it picking up the echolocations with its jaw there. It's pinpointed it, just double checking, and straight away it's able to forage a fish. And you can see how deep that was then. That you know, the animal had to go quite deep into the sand or into the seabed there, and it was still able to detect that item, which is really, really cool. You know, they're doing that in the dark, they're doing that in, you know, places where they can't even see the food. So it really, really is an effective way of feeding for these animals. So when it comes to this sort of echolocation and the way that these animals use sound, it does mean that they are quite sensitive to sound, or very sensitive in certain species. And we know as humans, we are inputting anthropogenic noise into the environment. We are obviously trying to reduce those impacts, but it still does happen. And we do have low frequency noises from vessels, which are affecting more of our baleen whales. We have seismic surveys, which produce high noise outputs, propellers from vessels as well. But then, you know, we're trying to turn to a net zero and have our sort of green industrial revolution, which is really, really good for us. However, piling and creating offshore wind turbines is really, really it's really, really loud. So if you imagine you have a monopile, I think we are leaning against monopiles now and going towards more of a jacket, which is what the turbine sits on. But a monopile is simply a pile that is hammered into the seabed. And it's hammered quite deep. And this produces a really loud sound, and it's really localized. So any animals that are in the area can't really get away from it. They'll have to go quite far, but then they'll have to, you know, return once this sound has stopped. And sometimes it can go on for hours. And seismic surveys, although they are also very loud, they're quite transient. So they will go out of an area quite quickly. So we do need to consider that when we're looking at our developments, and that's mainly what my job is. So my job is to mitigate and work out how much sound we're going to produce during these activities. Are marine mammals going to be affected? What species are going to be affected? So the most sensitive species, and how are we going to mitigate this? And if you go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we can mitigate these impacts. So this is just an example here of some of the guidelines that we follow, but there are guidelines worldwide. So we do have a number of guidelines released by JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. This is just the seismic surveys here. This was released in 2017, and we have piling, and UXO guidelines as well, issued from the JNCC. They often have a common theme. So you'll often start with a pre-monitoring search. So you'll search for maybe 30 to 60 minutes before an activity takes place. You will then have a ramp up or a soft start. So this is where, rather than starting out your output straight from the off, and that noise is introduced to the environment straight away really loud, they will start off ramping up that noise. So it'll start off at a low output, and it will slowly and incrementally increase until at that full output, and then the activities will commence. There are lots of different ways of mitigating as well. We can use noise abatement systems. So this is such as bubble net curtains, which have been introduced, I'd say, probably, you know, a good few years ago, but they are really gaining a lot more popularity now. They are logistically quite complicated and pricey to set up, but what it involves, so say you have this monopile that you're hammering into the seabed, you will set up a system of tubes around this with holes in, and you will effectively make a bubble curtain. So this tube will be full of air, and you'll simply be producing air from this tube. That bubble net curtain has really, really been shown to reduce sound propagation, the noise propagation from that pile, from that monopile. So you can really reduce the impact on the animals in the area as well. There are other guidelines. So there are guidelines issued by New Zealand, their Department of Conservation. There are guidelines issued by BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in America to manage the Gulf of Mexico. They all do vary, so some are stricter than others, and there are obviously guidelines in Ireland as well. But it's just interesting to note that this, this really cool adaptation and this thing that they've evolved does make them sensitive to our activities, and we need to consider that in our activities. Next slide, please. And this is just a lovely video. Again, you might want to mute it. That is okay. So I was recently on a trip and I had to include my videos in this presentation, obviously. So these are some humpback whales that stayed with us for about an hour. We got some spy hopping, looking at us. There were about 3 humpback whales, and it just goes to show that they're not scared. This boat was making noise. It wasn't impacting them. They played with us for an hour, so they were clearly well fed. So it's in a good, productive area. But yeah, I just wanted to include that because who doesn't like a spy hopping humpback whale? Next slide, please. So just to conclude, like Claudia said, it's a brief talk today, and we kind of want a bit of discussion and engagement. So any questions you have after this, do pop yourself on, turn your camera on, or pop your questions in the chat. That's fine. But yeah, so as Claudia said, we've got 1,400 species of bats. They use sound to see in the dark and for communication, very similar to our cetaceans as well. And they can determine species based on the calls. And when it comes to cetaceans, we have around about 90 or so species. They use sound for a number of reasons, because sound really, really travels well in our water medium. And this means, unfortunately, they are sensitive to noise. And they do use sound in the form of echolocation. And interestingly as well, we can actually determine species based on the sounds that they make as well. Next slide. Thank you, Claudia. So that's pretty much everything from us. If anybody has any questions, I think that Annie just wanted to say a little bit about member networks, but then we're free to take any questions.
Yeah, so thank you, Claudia and Ashleigh, it was fascinating. So just to highlight a few things, we've had a whole series of webinars recently on bioacoustics. So we've got one coming up on the 9th of June on survey protocols for bioacoustic monitoring and surveying of birds. If you've missed any of the other webinars and would like to attend, you can still get recordings of them. So it was just to highlight that because it tied in so nicely with this event as well. But we will move on to questions, but equally, I would like you to have a think of any member network events that you would like to see happening either virtually or in person in Scotland. And if you're interested in hosting one yourself with the support of myself and the committee, then do give us ideas as well. It'll be much appreciated. We've got one question coming in already from Isabel Flicker. This one's addressed for Claudia. So, is the ability of bats to echolocate affected by events such as music festivals? That's a good question.
So, we don't actually know that much about the influence of anthropogenic noise. Generally, if you're out with a bat detector and listen to other sources of ultrasound noises, they're mostly things like cars, machinery, music festivals. Speakers emit a certain amount of ultrasound, but actually not very much. You have to buy special ultrasonic speakers if you want to emit in these frequencies, which is quite expensive equipment. So I think they also hear in our hearing range. I think there is more of a disturbance, potential disturbance going on in our hearing range than actually an overlap with the echolocation frequencies. So it's a kind of a different thing. It's not interfering necessarily with the echolocation, but there's still potential of disturbance from music events just because of the noise levels. So they hear in our hearing range quite well, because I guess a lot of noises from predators and all of that will be made in this frequency range. So bats have not lost the ability to hear in the non-ultrasound, in the kind of human hearing range either.
Okay, we've got another question, Claudia, for you before we move on to one for Ashleigh. This is from Taylor Smith. You mentioned that some bats hunt for fish, and how do they do that? Do their echolocations go through the water surface, or does it bounce off the water surface? So does it go through or off the water surface?
Whew. I'm afraid I don't know.
One to come back on.
Yeah, all I can say is they some of them can use their tail membrane actually to scoop up things, but how exactly the echolocation works with water, I'm not certain, whether they detect ripples or the actual prey species. But I will ask all my colleagues if anybody knows. I'm sure there's papers about that I can look up.
Okay, thank you. And question for Ashleigh about the JNCC guidelines from 2017. Are those the most recent ones, or have they been updated and reviewed since? Are there any likely to be any new ones coming out in the next wee while?
So they are the most recent guidance. A lot of the guidance is due a review and reissue. I know that the Irish guidance is from 2014, the New Zealand guidance is 2013, and the American guidance is 2016. 2017, funnily enough, is the most recent one. But yeah, they all are absolutely due a revision, and because we have lots of new technologies now, our way of acoustic monitoring has changed. That's a lot more effective than it used to be, and in some of the guidance it says that you can't use acoustic monitoring, which shouldn't really be the case now, because it is a lot more effective, particularly at monitoring or detecting our sensitive species like harbour porpoise. They are small species, they're shy, elusive, they'll move away from a boat. However, they live in cold waters, they have to keep that core body temperature quite high, so they are constantly foraging, pretty much. Feels like me on a Sunday, constantly grazing. But that's how they operate. So they're constantly echolocating. So PAM is a lot more, or passive acoustic monitoring is a lot more effective at detecting these animals than detecting them visually. So they are absolutely due an update. As to when that will be, I do not know. I do think that there will be some PAM guidelines coming out soon, but as to what they will say and who will be issuing that, I'm not sure. But yeah, we'll just have to watch the space and hope that they get updated pretty soon.
Excellent, thanks Ashleigh. Question from Emily. Emily, did you want to come off mute and ask yourself? If not, I can do it for you.
I can do. I'll just read it out. But it was yeah. Well, first I just wanted to say amazing talks. I'm a marine mammal person, but it was really cool to hear about bats and think about the parallels, and they're actually quite similar but so different. Yeah. But my question's for Ashleigh, and it's more. It just sparked some thoughts when you were talking about wind farms and the technologies, and I was wondering whether the newer ones that we're moving towards, they still require piling, but it's a lot less. And then my other question was that you mentioned that we're moving away from the monopiles, pin piles type of things, and whether or not that move away was driven by, because we know it impacts marine mammals and makes lots of underwater noise, or was it because it's cheaper to use other technologies and it's just a bonus that marine mammals are less impacted now? Or yeah, it just made me wonder. Maybe you don't know the answer, but I just wanted to ask that question.
Yeah, of course. So the first question, you were wondering about the jacket type and how that compares to the monopile. So the jackets generally require less piling, so they will still need piling in, but they won't need to go to such a depth, because you've got that 3D structure that allows for it means that you don't have to hammer it in so as deep, because you've got that support from the full structure. And yeah, interesting question about is the move away from this because of underwater noise? I think probably not. It's a great byproduct of that, but even for the piling, you still need to do all the piling mitigation. So it's not like somebody's we've changed it because now we don't have to mitigate, or you know that they don't have to go through that environmental process, because you still have to mitigate for both. I think you don't need as much hammer energy. So you don't need as much, it's probably less time at sea, because you don't need to hammer them in as deep as a monopile, and you don't need as much of a strong hammer hit. So it's probably a combination. I think they're more sturdy in the water. It's less time at sea, less hammer output, therefore less health and safety risk. And yeah, just so happens that it does produce less underwater noise. But you know, again, we are moving away from that even more with floating offshore wind, and that is still very much an unknown. They aren't piled into the seabed, but they will be attached somehow through chains or some kind of link, and we don't know what the impact of that will be. So we need to look, you know, there's quite a bit of work going on floating offshore wind, but it is still very much in its infancy, and it's still getting developed. So some people are using cables, some people are using chains. These chains rattling over a bigger expanse is going to have that cumulative impact over that, you know, large space. So we do need to investigate that a lot more. We are still learning more about these new technologies.
Thanks, Ashleigh. I think you may have answered some of this next question, but Anna, do you want to come off mute and ask?
Yeah, I can do. Thanks both for your talks. They were really interesting. I was just wondering if, as we move to like renewable energies, whether the soundscape of the ocean is going to change, and if you thought that maybe it's going to benefit cetaceans like we hope or expect that it will do.
Very, very good question, and one I could probably postulate, but definitely not predict. So when we're talking about moving towards renewable energy, we're talking about wave energy, marine energy, so like tidal devices, and we're talking about sort of offshore wind. That's what we have to date. Offshore wind still requires a lot of vessel maintenance. There's vessels going out there all the time. There's guard vessels staying around wind farms all the time. So it's not going to reduce any more traffic. If we increase wind farms, there's going to be, you know, more of that. When we're thinking about tidal devices, we don't have that many around the UK. We are opening a tidal testing site in Wales now, where, you know, developers can come and put in their turbines and test what works. But often with these tidal devices, they're put in areas of high tidal movements, so you don't really get marine mammals there. So it's not going to have such a huge impact on marine mammals. But again, you've got maintenance to those tidal devices, and you know, the vessels all create noise underwater. But then we're taking away the seismic surveys and the seismic vessels. So I think it probably won't, I think maybe it won't change all that much, because we're increasing our renewable sites and maintenance operation, but we're reducing all our seismic surveys and our oil and gas output. So I think probably for the initial period, I don't think it will change that much. But then, you know, watch this space, we might end up having hydrogen vessels. I know there's lots and lots of research going into making cleaner, greener ships and making them less noisy. So, you know, fingers crossed that happens. And then if we do have this real big renewable industrial revolution in the UK, then we could have these quieter ships alongside that as well. I think that would really, really help these sensitive animals underwater.
Thanks, Ashleigh. I'm just going to ask one question for Claudia so you can catch your breath a minute. I often get asked by students, Claudia, as to how they can get involved in bat surveying and what sort of detectors they might get. Have you got any tips, Claudia, as to if you're just starting up in the looking at bats, where's best to start?
Yeah, there's so many types of detectors you can get, from around £80 to a few £1,000 worth. So I would definitely recommend, if you're starting out, to start at the basic level, because these detectors are great to kind of pick up the basic skills you will need later on, no matter what detector you're using. Actually, it's the same basic skills. There are a few courses on the Bat Conservation Trust website where you can actually learn how to use a detector and how to identify bats. And with these courses, once you've got a basic skill of bat identification, you can also participate in the citizen science projects that Bat Conservation Trust is running. So we have the National Bat Monitoring Project, where there's a different survey types. You can do roost counts, where you count how many bats are in a roost, or field surveys where you walk transects, or waterway survey where you walk a transect along a river, for example, or another water course. All of these surveys you can find on our Bat Conservation Trust website, and you can sign up online and go through a process of developing your bat skills, basically, and then always take part at the next more difficult citizen science project. So that's a great way to build up your skills and knowledge, actually, even for professional skills later on.
That's really useful, Claudia, and certainly because many, during the pandemic, many students weren't getting those practical skills and applications. So it's certainly something that crops up quite often. A question from Taylor Smith. Do you want to pose the question to Ashleigh?
I'm happy to read it if
That's fine, I can read it out if you want. So conducted an essay on sonar sounds at university and wondered how much it actually affects cetaceans. Does it affect them in the way they hunt or block communications between family pods?
Yeah, so sonar does really affect these animals. There was a case, quite a famous case in the Canary Islands, where multiple beaked whale strands. So beaked whales are a group of these cetaceans that are absolutely phenomenal. They are deep diving. They can dive up to 3 hours. They dive up to depths of 3,000 meters. They are pretty cool in cetacean world. They, unfortunately, because they are diving down to these deep depths, when they are scared or sort of taken by surprise, they will immediately come to the surface. And what it was found with all these animals that stranded around the Canary Islands was that they actually had symptoms of the bends after doing necropsies, and it wasn't thought that these animals could suffer the bends before. And what the bends is when you're a diver, if you come up too quickly, you can get nitrogen bubbles in your brain. Which can, it can be fatal, and it can really affect you. And these animals all had this symptom. And nobody knew why. And then I think the military sort of got involved in the investigations, and it was linked to a sonar exercise that was happening offshore around about the same time. So it can have really detrimental effects on these animals. And I do know with the US military, before they often have a marine mammal person on board to try and detect these animals before they do emit any sonar. So I do know that there are efforts to try and reduce this impact. However, to detect an animal acoustically, it has to be vocalizing, which it may not be. It may be on its way down, or it may be on its way up, or it may simply be resting. the animal might have to be in a certain direction to the microphone that's listening. Because of the way that sound moves underwater, directionality is really, really important. So there are certain, you know, say blind spots, as it were, where these animals may not be heard or detected. So yeah, it really does have an impact, and you know, it would affect the way that they hunt if they are taken by surprise. You know, if an animal is foraging at these deep depths and it's taken by surprise and has to come to the surface, even if it's not fatal, even if it doesn't suffer the bends, that is extra energy that that animal has had to exert, and you know, unnecessarily, and it will have to go down and forage again, and forage more possibly because of that extra energy. And in terms of blocking communication, it could well do. You know, it's really, really intense noise, and if you are a pod traveling together, I'm pretty sure that if that noise was next to you, you would not be able to hear the, you know, your pod mates, as it were, around you. So yeah, really, some really heavy impacts, you know, fatal in some cases, and it's just something that we have to keep on investigating and seeing how we can improve our practices to reduce those impacts. But really good question.
Thanks, Ashleigh. Laura Mulholland, your turn now.
Thanks, Annie.
Ponder.
Yeah, that's all right. Thanks, Claudia and Ashleigh, for your talks. Really interesting. I should sort of preface this by saying I'm not a consultant ecologist, so I'm not overly familiar with the ins and outs of planning and legislation. But seeing Ashleigh's talk and the detail of the research that we've been carrying out into the potential impacts on the marine environment from anthropogenic sound effects, and then as a consequence the mitigation that we're having to jump through, it just seems quite stark that, as far as I'm aware, we don't do anything similar for our terrestrial wildlife. I'm aware that we consider noise impacts on humans in some construction instances, but in terms of you know, if there's a major new housing development near to a bat roost, I think that I'm not sure that the impacts of the potential noise from the construction are considered. Just yeah, one for a ponder, really.
I was going to say, Claudia, I think that's for you. Yeah.
It's a really good point. I think it is a little bit because of the physics of sound, because in air sound doesn't travel as far, and especially the higher the frequencies, the less far it travels. And also possibly because mitigation for human disturbance simply quite often is putting up a wall of some sort and the sound bounces back. So I think the mitigation is a lot easier than it is for the marine environment, where just building a wall isn't an option. But I think there is more and more research. I'm not totally familiar with it, but more and more research into different habitats and how sound affects the environment, with now projects putting out little automated bat detectors, basically, or sound detectors that record in all frequencies, and attempts to program algorithms to actually be able to determine which sound is human made and which one is a kind of natural environment sound from animals, and then checking in different environments, making comparisons, basically. So it is a topic of interest at the moment, and there is a little bit of research going on. Unfortunately, I'm not absolutely familiar with what exactly is going on, but I know that with the development of algorithms and the sound analysis software, basically putting sound into different categories, there's a lot more scope to do big field surveys and finding out if there are effects on the environment.
Yeah, just a comment come in from Matt Tarry that, you know, bats do come out at night, and generally there's less anthropogenic noise caused by humans at night. So it's maybe a consideration as well. But yeah, certainly something that sounds like it should be factored in for mitigation. I think that's it on the questions, but if anyone wants to type any more in. But just while we do that, I just want to say a huge thanks to Claudia and Ashleigh, one for being such brilliant members of the Scotland Committee, but also for running this event tonight. It's been fascinating. I've learned so much about echolocation and bioacoustics. And just interesting, I think when we had this idea, it's just like, well, just from two completely different perspectives. So yeah, thank you both for your time and effort. For people that are joining for the first time, we hope to see you back at another member network event soon. As I say, the next one in June is an in-person event at Blacklaw Wind Farm, and that's being done with Scottish Power Renewables. Unfortunately, it's fully booked. We capped the numbers at 25, but we've now extended it to 40, and it's booked straight away. So it's obviously a really popular event. So we will look to do similar events as well in the future like that. So yeah, any ideas, anytime for member network events, if you're keen to host one in your area, the committee and myself will definitely help. And as we say, they can be informal events. We've had walks along a river to look at invasive species. We've had good excuses to meet up in the pub to discuss some particular bit of legislation. So yeah, very much respond to what you would like to see happening. So just checking if any more questions have come in. Yeah, a comment from Laura saying, you know, bats are nocturnal, sleep in their roost during the day. So yes, very vulnerable to disturbance. And Taylor Smith, looks like you need to contact Claudia about getting involved in bat surveying. You'll find Claudia's detail. Oh, there you are, already posted. Thank you, Claudia, about the National Bat Monitoring Programme. So yeah, but any questions after this, we'll share a feedback form probably tomorrow or Friday. But do let us know if you have any comments or questions. But if not, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.